Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be talking about another book. This one is another Pulitzer Prize winning finalist. Actually, in this case, it won the Pulitzer Prize in 2010 for Best Nonfiction Work, and that is the book The Dead Hand. The book is called The Dead Hand, The Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy. It was written by David E. Hoffman. It was published actually in 2009, but it won the Pulitzer in 2010, I believe. And as you can guess by the title, the book details the arms race, really the latter half of the Cold War. It doesn't touch too much on the Cold War's early days, doesn't really talk at all about Truman or Eisenhower, very little about JFK, a brief aside to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a very small amount about Nixon. It kind of starts around Carter, but really, any of the book's discussion of the Cold War prior to Reagan is just backstory, just filler to understand how did we get to where we were in the 1980s. And then the real core of the book details 1980 through to, late 1970s through to the, mid 90s with a little bit of an epilogue after that to the late 90s and early 2000s. The book really details, kind of takes you from the pinnacle of the arms race when tensions were at their highest, nuclear arsenals were at their highest, and really kind of details the evolution of nuclear as well as biological weapons. It doesn't talk too much about chemical weapons, interestingly enough, but it really spends a good deal of time about talking about nuclear weapons, biological weapons, and kind of where we went from the situation in the world in the early 1980s all the way through to today, and talks about sort of the lasting legacy of the arms race, as the title would hint at. David E. Hoffman is the author. He's listed as a journalist more so. He works as a contributing editor for the Washington Post, but most of his books seem to be more history in scope. So he's only written 3 books that I can find. The Oligarch's Wealth and Power in the New Russia, which was written in 2002. My understanding is it details kind of Yeltsin to early Putin days. And then The Dead Hand, which came out in 2009. And then he just wrote a new book. It's called The $1 Billion Spy, A True Story of Cold War Espionage and Betrayal. So while he may be a journalist per se, he certainly tends to write more regarding history, specifically Cold War or Russia. The book is very well written. It's very well put together, and starts with a sort of a famous scenario in 1983, I believe it was, when Russian missile systems pick up incoming U.S. ICBMs. First just one, and then numerous ICBMs. And all of the diagnostics and everything that's run as a test indicate this is real. This is a real missile strike that's coming in to hit the Soviet Union. And the decision was made by the commander of the Russian early warning missile system, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who had the night watch. Basically decided, you know what, no, this doesn't make sense, this isn't a real attack. And it's really interesting because the book focuses a lot on Russia, focuses a lot on the Russian perspective of the Cold War, and we don't get that a whole lot. There certainly is a lot about Reagan and a lot about Bush, but that's more or less background and filler. What I found really interesting about this work is it seemed to focus more exclusively on the Russian perspective during that late Cold War, focuses very heavily on Gorbachev, tells some interesting little stories about how Brezhnev was freaking out so much during a nuclear war test. So they're going through the drill of firing the nuclear weapons and, a hypothetical war, and he apparently turned incredibly pale and turned his advisors multiple times and said, this is just a drill, issuing these orders are not going to launch any weapons, are they? And he was very nervous, almost like a breakdown, borderline breakdown, despite it only being a drill. It's fascinating to me the way this book really looks inside what was going on in Russia, but it does so in kind of an odd way. So it focuses heavily on the arms race. It has a story of an anthrax outbreak at a town in the Ural Mountains, and that was hushed up and covered up by the Russians. So it's got a lot of little tidbits and a lot of little factoids. It really does a good job of fleshing out the Russian biological weapons program, and to a lesser extent the Russian nuclear program. What I was slightly disappointed about is it doesn't really talk about the chemical weapons at all. It really just focuses on nuclear and biological. It has a few asides to chemical weapons, but that's about it. The core of the book seems to be focusing on Gorbachev's attempt to disarm and his communications with Reagan and Reagan's, vision of Star Wars as well as disarming, and then the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union and the handling of that. I don't want to go too much into the book because it's an interesting book, but I also don't really want to spoil things too much. It's very much in the Damascus incident vein of history, written a little bit more like a history book than kind of a narrative novel as the Damascus incident was. But I think the two books go well together. The Damascus incident really talked about the U.S. nuclear program and nuclear accidents within the United States, but also talked about the evolution of nuclear strategy, whereas the Dead Hand focuses more on sort of the culmination of the arms race and into the realization of a need to disarm. But it also talks about, it really kind of paints a dangerous picture of, what could go wrong and how close maybe we came on a few incidents to nuclear war. But it doesn't seem quite as tied together maybe in a narrative fashion to me. It does seem that it kind of just goes year to year, incident to incident, and I don't feel there's a clearly strongly put together narrative with the book. I'm a little bit uneasy. It's a lot of interesting tidbits and stories, but I other than the fact that nuclear weapons are dangerous and that there's lots and lots of leftover nuclear parts from from the fall of the Soviet Union, and that even today, some of these warehouses with limited security and nuclear material in them are being discovered. Outside of that, I'm not sure what it's trying to say. It's trying to say nuclear weapons are dangerous. It's trying to say that Reagan and Gorbachev nearly eliminated all nuclear weapons, but the stumbling block was Star Wars. It doesn't paint a particular... It paints some interesting portraits, but it doesn't really seem to say much as far as so Gorbachev, it kind of talks about he's a clear reformer. He has very strong opinions about reforming the Soviet Union, but he doesn't really want the Soviet Union to fall apart, but he wants to eliminate nuclear weapons to get, some of this burden off the Russian back, and he's trying to work with Reagan, and Reagan's all eager to work with him, except when it comes to Star Wars, and they kind of bash each other's, skulls against a wall, because Reagan's never willing to budge on Star Wars, and Gorbachev basically gets exacerbated, saying, well, why the hell not? And then on Reagan's side, it doesn't paint him particularly flattering as kind of the stubborn, individual who just, won't give in and won't negotiate on certain points, and just kind of expects the Soviets eventually to adhere to, to what he would like to see. But at other times, it paints him in somewhat of a flattering light. It's almost painting both Reagan and Gorbachev as these two individuals who have some high-minded ideals but are not terribly efficient about going about what they want to do. Gorbachev feels that Reagan's treating him coldly and kind of ignores him. Reagan kind of does that, and then when they have meetings, isn't always clear, isn't always coherent. There's a lot of miscommunication between them. They think they're on the same page when they're not. They really don't understand each other. It's an interesting look at kind of some of the negotiations that went on during the Cold War between the Russians and the Americans, and how both sides really, despite sort of the narrative that we hear today, didn't really fully understand each other. And maybe that's a risk. Maybe that's what it's trying to say. Maybe it's trying to say, we thought we understood them, they thought they understood us, and in many cases we were talking past each other and not really understanding each other, and that, when it comes to nuclear weapons, is scary. The book's title, The Dead Hand, is pulled from the Russian Doomsday machine. So during the later part of the Cold War, the Russians were paranoid about an American nuclear strike that would eliminate the Soviet leadership before orders to retaliate could be given. They worried that the Americans might launch a nuclear strike and the Russians would have no way to retaliate because all the leaders would be killed too quickly before they could issue the orders. So the Russians built an autonomous or semi-autonomous nuclear weapons system. It's really interesting. So basically there's a command bunker, a ultra deep command bunker with a few watch officers, and there are all these sensors that are put up over Russia to detect things like bright lights and radiation detectors, and if communications with headquarters goes out. So the idea was basically command would flip a switch in a time of crisis to the system, and then this system would begin listening and monitoring throughout Russia to determine has nuclear war happened? Have nuclear weapons gone off? And if a certain sequence of events occur, so for example, if communication at the computer facilities is lost with headquarters and isn't reestablished within a certain period of time, and if these detectors of bright lights detect what would be nuclear flashes, detects those, then that's another trigger set. And then if radiation begins being picked up by other sensors, then again that's another one of these things that would go off and indicate, okay, there's a nuclear strike underway, we need to launch a retaliatory response. The interesting thing about this, and it was codenamed by the Americans as the dead hand. If you look and search the dead hand online, and the book references it as well, many people seem to think it was a fully automated system, that once it was turned on, once the high command said, okay, it's a crisis, we need to flip this thing on, then it could issue orders to launch nuclear weapons on its own. And what would happen is when the detectors said basically there was a nuclear attack underway, they would launch a series of command rockets, which were ICBMs that would fly horizontal across Russia, broadcasting nuclear launch orders to Russian missile silos, Russian submarines, Russian bomber bases. And in some cases, the Russian missiles were actually able to be launched even if the launch orders were not given by the silo commanders. The missiles would be able to autonomously launch themselves. Now, obviously, it would have to be a solid-fueled missile to do that. A liquid-fueled missile would need to be fueled first. Obviously, you can't autonomously launch bombers. You still need the crew to fly it. I would imagine the same for the submarine. You've got to have the submarine give the order to fire. But at least some of the Russian ICBMs theoretically were capable of launching an automated strike, which is terrifying. And interesting that this was developed in the 1980s because the movie Dr. Strangelove, which rests on the premise of a Russian doomsday machine, came out in the 60s. And also eerily similar to Dr. Strangelove, the Russians didn't broadcast that they had this. They kept it a secret, which is, again, bizarre. You would think this kind of a weapon, you would want everybody to know you have this weapon. Otherwise, what's the point? What's it deterring if no one knows that you have it? And the book kind of points that out, just like in Dr. Strangelove, where Dr. Strangelove calls out the Russians and says, the whole point of this system is lost if you don't tell everyone about it. If no one knows you have this doomsday device, then, how the hell, what's the point? And the book makes that same claim, that in this pervasive sort of Soviet culture, it was never announced that the Russians had this. So in the early 90s, it was largely believed the system was fully autonomous. There were some leaks that came out, and people thought, holy crap, the Russian nuclear arsenal rests on a computer. What if somehow it got switched on in a crisis and there was a computer bug and orders to launch, went out inadvertently? You could have an end of the world initiated by a computer. Interestingly, this book makes the claim that the automated system was never developed. It was a semi-automatic system, so all these sensors and equipment would basically determine, is there a launch? But at the end of the day, the final order would have to be issued by a couple of humans in a super deep bunker that could withstand even nuclear weapons. Not something like Cheyenne Mountain that could be destroyed by SS-18s or other nukes in a mountain, but something that was so deep that even the biggest nukes couldn't hit it. And they said that this could be a high-level official, but in reality, in most cases, if it was a surprise bolt-out-of-the-blue attack, you'd have a couple of junior watch officers. And, the book poses some interesting questions at times. Are these officers really going to launch it? What's the point at that point? If there's a nuclear strike that's already occurred, what do you gain by wiping out millions more people by retaliating? And it really paints that picture of, there was a lot of uncertainty in the Soviet Union about their missile crews. Would they launch if they were given the orders? Would high command launch if they were given the orders? And that was another way the system was portrayed is basically, Brezhnev or Cherezhnev could ignore their responsibilities on giving the orders to launch, and they could basically press a button that would give the authority to these individuals in this bunker or this computer system, depending on whether it was fully automated or whether it was semi-automated. The book makes the claim it was semi-automated, and the system in Russia today is known as perimeter. I know I've been talking a little bit about this, but it's really not the core of the book. The book is not really about the perimeter system. It's not really about the dead hand. The dead hand is kind of misleading, except to imply that, despite the Cold War being over, despite massive disarmament occurring, there's still huge risk. There's these genetically modified biological warfare agents that the Russians developed against treaties. And it kind of details the process of the Russians developing these hyperbugs designed to resist, any attempt to prevent them. In some cases, the bug would infect someone, they'd get sick, and then the way the bug was designed, when the human body went in to fight it, it would be able to beat the virus off, but in doing so, it would so damage the body that it would end up killing itself, basically. So the body would kill itself to kill the bug, and there's just a lot of interesting kind of chilling tidbits in there. I think it's an interesting book. I think if you want to understand the timeline and what occurred between 1980 all the way to the mid-1990s, it's a useful book to have. It's not a clear, here's my take on this figure or that figure. It's very much ambiguous. It very much leaves it up to the reader, and to some extent that's frustrating. It's hard to say, like, okay, well, which is the real Reagan, which is the real Gorbachev? But in some sense, it's also probably more realistic and more honest, where it leaves out that evaluation saying so and so was good or bad, and makes you think about it, makes you see, okay, well, this is what they did. That seems a little bit off, or that, it really treats them as humans. And I think a lot of history books miss that. So on one end, it's a little bit frustrating because it doesn't really seem to have a opinion of itself, but it kind of makes the reader decide, what do they think about these figures? What do they think about these issues? And in that sense, I think maybe it's intended to spark some discussion. So in that sense, I think it's well done. An interesting tidbit the book talks about is George W. Bush, or George Herbert Walker Bush, he actually did the most for nuclear disarmament of any president. In a single year, he had 5,300 warheads dismembered. When it was clear the Soviet Union was coming apart, he unilaterally ordered the reduction of almost the entire U.S. nuclear tactical force, as well as dramatic reductions in nuclear weapons without any kind of treaty by the Russians. Reagan and Gorbachev went back and forth and negotiated and talked a lot, and there was a lot of sort of sea change in terms of relations, but really outside of eliminating intermediate range missiles, they didn't accomplish a ton in the way of warhead reduction. And the fact is, George H.W. Bush gets almost no credit for that, and he did more than any president to reduce the U.S. nuclear arsenal. I did some research for this book, and actually George W. Bush, his son, reduced the U.S. nuclear arsenal by 51% between 2000 and 2008. George Herbert Walker Bush reduced the U.S. nuclear arsenal in just 4 years by 41% from 1990 to 1994. By far the largest by percentage reductions, and also the largest in terms of raw numbers of any presidents. Obama's reduced the U.S. arsenal by about 10%. Clinton was about 22%. Reagan, I want to say 7%, or was it 4%? And then Carter and Nixon both around 7%. So in terms of raw percentages and also raw numbers, the Bushes did more than anyone else to reduce the likelihood of a nuclear war, or at least the number of weapons on hand for such a conflict. Not making a value judgment about either their presidencies, but it was interesting. And again, the book kind of portrays H.W. Bush as another one of those kind of multifaceted figures, portrays him as very conservative and unwilling to act rashly, which may have been wise in the 90s, but then when it was clear the Soviet Union was falling apart, he moved rapidly with purpose and passion to reduce the number of U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe and also throughout the globe. So again, one of those portraits where it's not really saying, it's not really making a value judgment about anyone in this book. It's more or less just detailing history as it happened, and again, I think that misses some value. You would expect the historian to have an evaluation of someone at some point, basically make an argument to your reader, say, here's my proposal, here's my thesis, here's my justification, now what do you think about it, as opposed to just kind of saying, well, then this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened. But the way the book is written, it does a good job, and it does feel genuine and well written, and like it's an interesting read. I do think it makes a good companion to the Damascus incident because it kind of takes it beyond just nuclear weapons safety and strategy and brings it into the near past, and also kind of explains how we got to where we are today. The post-Soviet fallout chapters are pretty chilling in talking about how, in some cases, warehouses full of highly enriched uranium, in some cases enriched to the point where you could have built a Hiroshima-style bomb just by bending metal a certain way and then, putting an explosive charge to create a gun-style bomb, which is very simple relatively. Probably something that could be done almost in like a garage of a scientist, as opposed to like a plutonium device, which is much more sophisticated and complex. But just kind of detailing how crazy the security was, lack thereof, throughout the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union during the collapse, and just kind of shows you, how dangerous the situation in the world was, and maybe still is. Some of this stuff was still being discovered and secured in recent years, so it certainly paints a somewhat terrifying picture. On the whole, the book is strong. It's hard for me to say it was making this argument, it was making this claim, because it didn't really feel like it was. It felt like it was more just kind of listing off facts and events, but doing so in a way that was fresh and new and didn't feel dry or anything like that. So I do think it has some value. I'm not going to do every one of my book reviews where I say check this book out or check that book out or what have you. My intent is not to say go buy this, but I will say it does, as I've already mentioned a few times, does make a good parallel to the Damascus incident. I think they go well together if you're trying to understand the Cold War. This focuses, again, as I've said already, almost exclusively on the end of the Cold War, and it's written well. I mean, it won a Pulitzer Prize. It wouldn't do that if it was a piece of garbage. Not quite as compelling as the Damascus incident, but if I was going to be rating kind of the Cold War books I've been reading, and I've read 4 or 5 in the last couple of weeks, I've only done videos on 2 of them. If I was rating kind of the books I've read recently, I would say kind of the Damascus incident is up there as number 1, interestingly, because it ran the runner-up in Pulitzer. And then I would say that Dead Hand is number 2 in there. I was kind of hoping there'd be more on the perimeter system and the Dead Hand system based on the title. There wasn't, but it did talk a lot about the Russian biological program, which is something I didn't know a ton about. I knew it existed. I knew they did a lot regarding genetic modification of things like smallpox and anthrax, but I didn't know a lot of the details in there. And it does paint some interesting portraits of some of the scientists involved there, too. It's very heavily based on memoirs and, first-person sources. So while it does kind of follow this general narrative of history as it plods along from the 80s to the present day, it does so in a very substantive and well-researched way, with plenty of first-hand accounts to back up the stories and claims that it's making. All in all, The Dead Hand is a solid and interesting book. I would recommend you check it out if you're interested in kind of the later part of the Cold War and kind of the collapse of the Russian Empire. I think it could use some work in terms of kind of telling a more compelling story about some of the major figures. I also think that it doesn't do a good job explaining the collapse of the Soviet Union. It builds up a really strong case to explain how we got to the 80s in terms of the arms race, but it doesn't explain, kind of goes from Gorbachev and Reagan having these talks to all of a sudden stating that Gorbachev is losing power and influence in Russia without really talking about why, without really detailing what was going on in the Soviet Union. And while that may not be the focus of the book, I felt it could have done a better job setting that up, because it seemed very abrupt, where all of a sudden Gorbachev is, in the height of his power, to now he's barely clinging on to power, but he's ignorant of it. And it doesn't communicate that very effectively, in my opinion. But nonetheless, regarding nuclear weapons and biological weapons, an interesting book, a good read, something that will make you not sleep as well at night. And if it is something you're interested in, there is an affiliate link in the description. If you click on that, I get a small percentage of anything you buy on Amazon, not just the book. So feel free to do that. I'd appreciate it if you do, but if you don't, that's fine. I just throw it in there because, frankly, I wanted to talk about the book, and if I'm going to talk about it, might as well get my cut from the man if anyone decides to buy it because of it, and if not, no harm, no foul. I'm not doing this for money. I just don't see the reason that Amazon should make 100% of it if anyone decides to buy the book. But you do what's right for you, and let me know what you guys think in the comments in the description. I don't think this review was as well put together, or maybe it's not even a review. That may be disingenuous to call it that. But that's kind of how I feel about the book, is that it's kind of disjointed. Despite doing a really good job telling the history, I don't feel like I came away from it in a way where I can say, here's what the book was telling me, and here's the conclusion it made. I didn't feel there was a conclusion, and I just kind of felt like I was reading about facts, almost like I was reading something out of Wikipedia, although much better written and with substantial stories behind it. But it didn't seem, it felt a little rudderless. So take that as it will. Anyway, guys, this is the Historical Gamer saying, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to try and do more videos more often. I haven't been doing as many recently, but this is just another one of those occasional book reviews that I do. And again, I hope everybody enjoyed. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.